What's going on, Guardians? It's Tizzle here, and I want to welcome you to Subclass School, the series where I break down everything you need to know about every subclass in Destiny 2. This is going to be a generic intro for all the videos going forward, so if you have seen some other videos in this series, feel free to skip ahead. I just want to mention a few disclaimers before we get started. For my testing, I didn't use any exotics that will impact an aspect or fragment in any way. Like, I may use Claws of Ahamkaras for showing a melee interaction because it helps me test more efficiently, or Vesper of Radius to show something on a subclass that revolves around rifts or class abilities. However, I would never use Vesper if I was using a fragment that gives class ability energy, because I want to show that fragment on its own merit. Same goes for mods. I may use Bomber or something to reduce a grenade cooldown, but I will never use that mod if what I am testing affects your grenade cooldown. Because again, these videos are designed to show you how each thing works on an individual level, by itself. So I don't want any interference from mods in these tests. And that being said, in much of the testing, I didn't even use more than one fragment. I would often have only one aspect equipped that wouldn't interfere with my testing, and then just the fragment that I am testing. Another thing, a huge shout out to the people at the Destiny Data Compendium. This is a spreadsheet that people in the community have created with all the info you could ever need on Destiny 2. It is linked in the description of every single one of my videos, so check them out. The spreadsheet is an amazing resource and an inspiration for me to take the info that they have gathered and put it into video form. So while I did do a ton of the testing myself, I also relied on the info from the compendium. So far, I have only really found one discrepancy between my tests and the info that they have, and I rely on them for certain values that I do not know how to test. Like Whisper of Hedrons, which gives stability and aim assist, I rely on their numbers, or most things regarding damage resistance. So again, much of this is my own testing, but I certainly use some of the data that they have sourced too, and I use their info to cross-reference my findings. Lastly, these videos took a ton of time and effort to produce, hours and hours of testing, screenshotting every aspect and fragment and piece of info from the compendium, editing the videos, trying to show as much info as I can without overdoing it, and showing every scenario, which would balloon the videos to be way too long. So if I say something reduces your rift cooldown by 30 seconds, you just have to believe me. I'm not going to show a clip of a 1 minute rift and then a 1 minute and 30 second rift cooldown. You have to just trust that I did the testing and prove this to be true. I want them to be in-depth and informative, but at the same time, not try to completely overwhelm the viewer with information and make it super boring to watch. These were entirely created by me and me alone. Even the PvP testing, I hopped on a friend's account on my laptop and would test what I needed to test. So for the hundreds and hundreds of hours I poured into these videos, a like and subscription would go a long way. I would love to hit 50,000 subs before the final shape, so if you could do me a solid and hit that like and subscribe button, it would mean the world to me. Now let's jump into the content. So for today's video, we'll be looking at the Stasis Verbs. There are 6 verbs in total. We have the big 3 being Slow, Freeze, and Shatter, and then we have the Stasis Elemental Pickup, which is a Stasis Shard, then Stasis Crystals and Stasis Overshield, not to be confused with a Void Overshield. So let's unpack these, starting with Slow. The in-game description reads, the target has slowed movement and ability regeneration. Their weapon performance is reduced. Slowed combatants have difficulty firing accurately, and overload champions are stunned. After accumulating enough slow stacks, the target is frozen. So the Destiny Data Compendium gives us some more info on this. It decreases our movement speed by 40%, jump height by 60%, and you also can't double jump. This means that if you have slow stacks in mid-air while clearing a gap, you'll probably just fall to your death. Combatants are also less accurate while slowed, and they move slower. In PvP, your stability, handling, reload speed, and recoil direction stats are all lowered by 75%, and you may also receive increased flinch. And then, much like Scorch, if you stack up 100 stacks of slow on an enemy, it will result in a freeze. There are many different ways to apply slow and freeze to targets, and I will go over those in the future subclass school videos. For this video, I want to stick to what the verbs themselves do. Additionally, a weapon perk like Chill Clip grants 40 slow, so this can apply slow and eventually freeze a target. Though this may be adjusted in the future, so it is better on certain types of weapons. It was nerfed because it was so good on the Riptide Fusion Rifle, allowing you to apply slow stacks very quickly to freeze targets. Also, this will not stun an overload if you are Radiant. Radiant gives anti-barrier, so it seems to override the slow. It's a weird interaction, but definitely something you want to be aware of. Cold Steel is another stasis weapon perk that applies 40 stacks of slow on a light attack and 60 stacks on a heavy. So, like I mentioned, if you stack up enough slow stacks, you can freeze a target. The in-game description for freeze is the target is trapped in stasis matter and is unable to move. After taking additional damage while frozen, the target shatters. So freeze will immobilize an enemy for 6 whole seconds. It doesn't matter the application of the freeze or the tier of the enemy, or if it is a GM or just a regular strike. The freeze lasts for 6 seconds. That being said, if it is a boss, it will be unhindered by the freeze and shatter after 3 seconds. So at least it will deal some damage from the shatter, but you cannot freeze bosses. In PvP, the freeze lasts 1.35 seconds, but freeze from a super will last 4.75 seconds, or you can try and break out, but at the cost of your health. And then, if it is a super on super battle, the numbers change as you can see. And you also can't freeze enemies in a Well of Radiance. Also, in PvP, the Compendium says you deal 50% less damage to frozen players with a primary weapon. But in my testing, I was hitting 23 to the body and 41 to the head, and then only 9 to the body and 17 to the head. So this was about 40% of your regular damage, so even weaker. This was super annoying to test as Mayhem is bugged right now, and also slow stacks weren't applying properly. But basically, primary weapons suck on frozen targets. And the freeze from things outside of a super barely lasts long enough to even test numbers on. Big shout out to my buddy TJ for helping me test this stuff. It's much appreciated. But you deal 10% more damage with a special weapon. So my slug shotgun hit for 181 at base to the body, but 199 when he was frozen. But it also did shatter damage, which accounted for like 204 damage. So if you can freeze an enemy in something like a bubble, this is a great way to kill an enemy. Lastly, my base melee hit for 116 damage, but hit for 256 when he was frozen. So your melee also deals 120% more damage in PvP to frozen targets. So back to PvE, frozen enemies receive 10% increased damage from special weapons, power weapons, and abilities, but receive 5% decreased damage from primary weapons. In the background gameplay, my auto rifle hits 1519 to the head when Carl is frozen, and 1598 to the head when he is not. So this proves the 5% less damage from a primary. Then my special weapon hits for 63,252 damage, and when frozen it hits for 69,577, a 10% increase. My heavy weapon at base hits for 6437, and then 7,081 when frozen. Again, 10%. I wanted to show you these exact values because coming up we actually have a discrepancy from the Compendium versus my testing. So next is melees. So my base melee deals 10,246 damage, and my base throwing hammer does 34,037 damage. I then freeze Carl and the base melee hits for 22,541, which is 2.2x or 120% more damage. But then the throwing hammer only deals 35,739 damage, which is just a 5% increase. The Compendium says it's 10%, but my testing showed that it's only 5. So then I tested Celestial Fire as well, and it too was just a 5% increase. Maybe these values are different on other melees. The point is that it increases a regular melee damage by a lot, being 120%, and a charge melee ability by only 5%, at least from my testing. And because this says abilities, I then tested a base fusion grenade. The grenade hit for 46,619 at base and 48,950 when frozen. Again, a 5% increase. So then I figured I should look at glaives, and with glaives I found it was 13,946 at base and 17,433 when frozen. Ignore the shatter damage numbers. So this is a 25% bonus, and I tested it with Synthos and it hit for 34,865, which is 2 times more damage than the frozen glaive melee. And the Compendium says the Syntheseps buff glaive melee damage by 100%, so this checks out. They do stack. And this would also work with a weapon perk like close to melee, or something like the Winterbite exotic glaive. So do with that info what you will. Normally, I just like to give the base info and let you guys figure out what can and can't work with it, but I wanted to mention these interactions specifically to show you that you can use freezing an enemy to deal increased damage in certain scenarios. So to summarize all these findings, your primary weapons do 5% less damage to a frozen target. This is without Whisper of Rending, but I will cover that in the Fragments subclass school. Then your special weapons deal 10% more damage to frozen targets, abilities do 5% more, base melees 120% more, glaive melees 25% more. These are the numbers that I want you to come away from this video knowing, because this info can be quite useful. Sure, bosses don't stay frozen, but if you had a Bleak Watcher ticking away on a boss during a damage phase, then your whole team would get periodic 10% bonuses to their heavy weapon damage for the brief moment the boss gets frozen. Plus, abilities like supers would deal 5% more damage, if it happened to land on the boss right when it was frozen. Plus, you would get some shatter damage in there as well, so this could add up over the course of a damage phase in the right scenario, so just something to think about. That being said, a hunter on a Celestial Goldie is probably going to do way more damage than having a hunter on Revenant and casting a Silence and Squall super to periodically freeze a boss to get that added slight damage buff throughout your damage phase. But in a day 1 raid where survivability is often more important than optimal damage, this could come in handy. Having a Stasis Bleak Watcher Warlock to lock down an encounter and then have them freeze the boss during a damage phase or something could be useful. Again, I know it may not be optimal, but it could be useful in the right situation. Moving on. So when an enemy is frozen, you can deal a bunch of damage to it, and when you reach a certain damage threshold, this will cause the freeze to shatter. The in-game description for Shatter is when a frozen target is shattered, they take damage and deal damage to nearby targets. Shatter damage causes unstoppable champions to become stunned. And once again, we have more data from the Compendium if you want more detailed info. But basically, when the shatter occurs, it deals extra damage to the target as well as some AoE damage. And as mentioned, this shatter damage will stun an unstoppable champion, so just freezing an unstop will not cause it to be stunned. This is an important distinction because if you shatter the freeze with a rocket, that first rocket will deal drastically less damage because the unstoppable has not been stunned yet. Where if you shatter it with a primary first and then deal damage with your heavy once it is stunned, you will deal way more damage. So just something that I think you should be aware of. Next up, we have Stasis Crystals. The in-game description states a crystal of solidified stasis matter. Upon creation, freezes nearby combatants and slows nearby players. Crystals can be destroyed, dealing damage in an area. And the Compendium shows us more info on them if you're curious. They last for 15 seconds, and you can freeze enemies within 2.6 meters of where they were made. They also apply 15 stacks of slow to a guardian per crystal. We also have a weapon perk called Headstone, which makes a stasis crystal upon getting a precision kill. So Stasis has some pretty great weapon perks that synergize with its verbs. Crystals can be very useful for AoE ad clear, especially this season thanks to the artifact mods. But I want to make one thing clear as well. I didn't use any artifact mods when doing any of this testing, and I didn't use Whisper of Fissures either, which increases crystal AoE and damage. I wanted you to see the base form of a stasis crystal. So next we have a Stasis Shard. This is the elemental pickup for stasis, and it states a small shard of stasis matter that can be collected to restore melee energy. These little things surprised me in my testing because they actually give a fair amount of melee energy back. And one thing I never realized was that if you make one on a higher tier enemy, it makes a large stasis shard, which gives you way more melee energy. A small shard gives 10% and a large one gives 50%. Sadly, stasis melees aren't all that strong, but if you make them, these can be picked up by other teammates as well. So this could be used in a support role. I also really like the large stasis shard that can be created. Like, think if other subclasses had that. Like, you kill a champion that was jolted, so the ionic trace you make gives you double the energy of a regular one. That would be really cool. Lastly, we come to the Stasis Overshield. For the life of me, I cannot find an in-game description of this, but it is different from a Void Overshield. I know Bungie is working on some reworks to Stasis, so this info may not last super long sadly, but I wanted to get it out there. So you can only get a Stasis Overshield with the fragment Whisper of Rhyme. And Rhyme states, collecting a Stasis Shard grants a small amount of Overshield, which falls off after 10 seconds. Collecting additional shards adds to the Overshield and refreshes the timer. So you can see this working in the background gameplay. And the Compendium says that we get 50% damage reduction from this Overshield, and that it does not apply when we are in our super. And you have to pick up a lot of Stasis Shards to accumulate a full Overshield. And that is basically all there is to know about the Stasis Verbs in Destiny 2. Leave a like and sub if you enjoyed the video or learned something. I know I learned a lot from all my testing. And be sure to tune in to the other subclass schools on Stasis, as there is lots more helpful info to come. Lastly, if you are still watching, thanks so much for watching to the end. I really appreciate it. Take care.